legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffitt and my guest today is Luke Dodson. In a follow-up to COVID-19, The Death of Tourism, published in March 2022, this talk explores how the situation regarding travel, tourism and general mobility has evolved since that time. We examine the various agendas seeking to restrict human activity and some of the philosophical dimensions of our need to travel and explore. From the original video description, arguably the single most significant infringement on freedom imposed by the 2020 pandemic lockdowns was on freedom of movement. Only travel deemed essential by authorities was permitted, and then only under strict control. National and international travel ground to a halt, while in some areas citizens were forbidden even from leaving their own homes. Second only to personal liberty, the biggest casualty resulting from these draconian restrictions has been the travel industry. In early 2022, global freedom of movement seems to be slowly returning, but will travel for business or leisure ever be quite the way it was during the years BC, before COVID? Or will globalist technocrats finally fulfill their openly stated goal of ending freedom of movement for all but their elite echelons, leaving the remainder of the world's population languishing in a virtual reality prison?
Hello and welcome, Luke, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Oh, thanks, Greg. It's great to be back.
Look, today we're going to be talking about basically travel and freedom of movement. And this is something that some people might listen to that and say, well, okay, what's the relevance of that? What's happening at the minute relating to that? But this is something that stems back to the C-19 years, let's put it that way, the pandemic response. And of course, there was major restriction of movement at that time for reasons that were purported to be obvious. Because pandemic, you can't go anywhere, you can't see other people, you can't move around, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah. And all sorts of things were introduced at that time to enforce this. Some actualized, and some did not. There was the idea of, passports and, vaccine passports, and everything went online. Everything was going to be delivered to your door. Everything was going to be virtual. In this response to this crisis, whatever you think about it, it was the first time in my lifetime, certainly, that we'd seen these sort of restrictions envisaged, if not enforced. So we're going to be talking about where we are now with that, because this is something that has not gone away. There's no question about it. It's issues of freedom of movement and of travel and transport are very, very current. They're some of the hottest political and social issues at the minute. But before we get into that, just tell listeners a little bit about yourself. Tell them, where they can find you online, what it is you do, what you're about.
So I'm a blogger and fellow podcaster. I put my content on Substack. It's called Flint and Steel. Is where you can find my stuff. A kind of a bit of a background as to where I'm coming from, sort of relevant to this topic, and how I actually got into blogging back in 2020 was that I have a long-standing connection to the sort of environmental movement. My mum was taking me to climate change marches when I was sort of 12, 13, environmental activist demonstrations, reclaim the streets and things like this. And so when over the course of that 20-year period or so, I wasn't particularly massively heavily involved in environmental activism in my adult life. Particularly, I got involved in a few local conservation campaigns. I did a bit of campaigning for the anti-fracking movement in the sort of mid 2010s. But I wasn't like a hardcore swampy type or anything. It's something that I clearly, valued, and a lot of the time thought, it'd be nice to live more naturally. I've spent some time at Tinker's Bubble, for example, which is an eco village in Somerset, and I've explored those sorts of things. But sort of keep it relevant. What happened with the environmental movement, as I saw it, was over the kind of 20-year period, it morphed very dramatically from being this back to nature, back to the land, green tree hugger hippie scene to this very technocratic, technologically orientated, and very corporate world, which in fairness, you could trace those things right back to the beginnings of the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. I have a friend actually who's working on a fascinating book, which is all about the history of sustainability. And it's wild, to use no pun intended. It's the history of the term, like sustainability, right from the start has been very complicated, and the environmental movement, very complicated, complex set of factors going on there. But what it seemed to me was that this was really reaching ahead in sort of 2020, and you had the Extinction Rebellion stuff, and all of that kind of climate activism, Greta Thunberg, and it all just seemed massively fake to me. So that's what got me into blogging, actually, was trying to write out what I was feeling about all these things that people around me seemed to be getting drawn into so heavily.
You're right. The massively fake thing is key here, because I think that we're a generation apart, but I think we have many of the same instincts. And I was reading in the 1980s, Alvin Toffler's Future Shock books from the Club of Rome, whatever you think about that, but warning of, climate emergency, or, it wasn't framed that way at the time, but it was like, the planet's in trouble, and going forward, things have to change. Many of the things that John Michael Greer, who were both followers of, and he's been my guest on the podcast many times, he refers back to that time, the oil shock of the early 70s and the peak oil movement that came from that. So I absolutely understood and empathize with that, the path that we're on as a species in terms of technology and the environment, cannot continue. But there was something, as you say, very fake, very questionable about the mainstream response to that. There's no question about that. And I think that's where that was the case back in the early 70s even. And it's continued. It went away somewhat in the 80s, as I've said many times, with particularly the American administration under Reagan, Morning in America, good times are here again. But it has really had a major resurgence in the first part of the 21st century. And you mentioned Greta Thunberg, and it's something. There's something about it that's hollow, and I'm not quite sure what that agenda is or what the reason behind that lack of substance is. But I mean, that's partly what we're here to explore.
With the sort of the travel restrictions that we were talking about in the kind of in the run up to this, I can see the point to that. I can see that there's a justification for reducing air travel. There are too many planes in the skies. I mean, for one thing, just whatever one thinks about the chemtrail notion, it does seem to be, I'm not necessarily suggesting that there's something deliberate going on behind that. Maybe there is, I don't know. But regardless, it seems to be, people seem to notice that the amount of exhaust going into the sky will kind of create this sort of cloud vapor, and it will change the weather a little bit. You know, it seems it's kind of nice not to have all these planes with all their exhaust going into the sky, you know. So I can understand why you'd want to what you'd want to reduce that, but it's never these Davos types going, well, we're going to lead the way, guys. We're scrapping our private jets. We're going to melt them down to create other things. We're going to recycle them, and we're going to travel to Davos on a bike or a horse and cart or something instead of flying in. They never say that. We say you've got to reduce your travel. You've got to, you know, that's the thing that I think I saw happening with the climate movement, was that it's very much a case of impoverishment for thee, but not for me. And all of these billionaires telling everybody that they have to live a reduced quality of life and eat bugs and, you know, stay in the pod or whatever it is. But they don't. And we saw this during the COVID restrictions, that the elite were gathering and having parties and traveling and going on holiday and all the things that they were already doing. But it was even better for them because there were none of us lot about. So they could, you know, just waltz through. I did know people who managed to travel during that time, which travel was possible. It was just, there was less of it, obviously. And, it was eerie, from what I hear, going through airports because they were so empty. So it probably was, if you did get to travel, probably was quite a nice time to travel, weirdly enough, you know.
One of the things that drove me to suggest that we have this conversation today was news headlines. Now, I don't pay any attention to the news, really. I made a vlog during the pandemic period entitled Stop Watching the News, encouraging people to do just that. But when I sign on to read my emails in the morning, one thing that happens first, a series of news headlines. You can just click through to your email, but first thing you get is news headlines. And I'd been just, observing this, as much news content as I do absorb is just, those first 4 or 5 headlines of what's current in the day. And I had noticed that I noticed 2 themes that kept coming up again and again, and have been for like a couple of years now, maybe longer than that. But and that was transgender and transport. It was war on motorists, constant news stories about motorists, or anybody indeed who want to move around. That was coming up, and the transgender thing. The transgender thing is not, I don't know, maybe tangentially relevant to all of this, but it was just every single day there was one or more, usually more than one, news story about a quote-unquote war on motorists, or about the costs going up of motoring or travel, insurance costs, you name it. I mean, and electrification of vehicles, problems with that. It was more than 50% of the news content, and that suggested to me that there was something going on, because that's pure propaganda. So there's a reason why they were trumpeting not only the transgender stuff, but the transport stuff.
Yeah, I noticed this as well, actually. And it is, once again, one of those really interesting moments of a kind of a ideological reshuffling going on, because, as I say, my background, I remember the road protests of the 90s. My family is very much on the side of them, because there was a huge push to build loads of roads in Britain in the 1990s, and destroyed quite a lot of, old growth forests and sacred sites and, all the rest of it. And back then it was like, it seemed very weird and fringe to have any kind of critical view of the prevalence of cars on the road. But it snuck in. It was snuck in by the back door. And then all of a sudden, it's kind of mainstream, but in a way that I don't recognize. I know quite a few other people from that generation, veterans of the road protest movement, don't support this kind of ULEZ or any of these sort of, controlling measures. Because it's obvious to anyone who's properly paying attention, I think. I mean, I could be speaking a bit presumptuously there, but it seems to me pretty obvious, and quite a few other people. It's not really about protecting the environment exactly, except as a kind of a global playground for some billionaires to waltz around in, shooting big game or whatever. That's the sort of, it's protecting the environment as this sort of, well, I mean, it's not as well, because there's all kinds of other things the same forces are getting up to, that are massively destructive to the environment. I mean, one of them is the net zero initiative is producing a huge amount of industrialization of the countryside, because they're trying to put up solar farms and batteries, huge battery storage centers. There's several that are optioned down the road from where I am currently. There's a solar farm they're trying to build a solar farm on the original Bag End up in Oxfordshire. That the literal Bag End that inspired Tolkien in his depiction of the Shire and Bag End, where Bilbo lives. So, the forces of Mordor managed to cloak themselves as being, they're really on the side of the Ents. And really all they need to do is industrialize Bag End and the Shire. And it will really be for, Saruman right there is this, Saruman is on board with the net zero agenda, guys. I mean, as a little kind of side note, there was actually an article in The Guardian a few years back criticizing Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings for its anti-progress, sort of anti-industrial, reactionary narrative. This is The Guardian, and so, right, okay, officially we can say The Guardian is on the side of Saruman and the orcs, so.
Well, yeah, because, Tolkien was very environmentally concerned, wasn't he? And, it's sort of thinly veiled in many of his narratives. There's something interesting about, I know we're talking about travel and transport and freedom of movement, and, obviously we're talking about, cars, personal transport related to that. There's something interesting in this for me, which I would like to understand, and so far, at least 2/3 of a lifetime, I haven't really managed to do so. I wouldn't use my term to describe myself as a petrol head, like a Jeremy Clarkson or, Top Gear type thing, but I love cars. I'm really interested in cars, and if in Mad Max, okay, there's an interesting crossover, I think, here. Mad Max, the series of post-apocalyptic films starring Mel Gibson, the Mad Max car, that big black thing that roars like thunder that he drives as a Ford Falcon XB. I get goosebumps if I hear that thing just turned over. You just start that, So what's that excitement about? It's about driving into the sunset in a machine like that. What on earth has got to do with human existence, human being, human survival? What is it about that sense of I can go anywhere I want at any time that seems to be so vital, in our experience of this realm? I feel it at a visceral level, but it seems to make no sense on one way. And this is tied into everything we're talking about, from, on one hand, freedom of movement, and go where you like, do what you want to do. And on the other hand, you can't do this. This is polluting. It uses up resources. It burns oil. It's horrible. It's destroying the environment, and everything in between. So there's something about it because it seems so abstract in a way. What's this thing with cars? What's that got to do with as much as the material to build cars has been on the Earth since the Earth was formed. It was only relatively recently that we put those materials together into these things, these machines.
Well, I also I quite like driving sometimes. I mean, there's obviously situations like a traffic jam or having to negotiate a tractor on a narrow country lane or something that are kind of annoying. But overall, I quite enjoy driving. And there's a certain modern romance that's been built up around a car. And you can see that going right back to like Kerouac's On the Road. I mean, if you read Kerouac's On the Road now, most of the book is just basically them driving around, smoking cigarettes and reefer and, going, yeah, wow, listening to jazz and just driving across America like it's nothing, it's real. It had a novelty back then, I think, in the sort of 1950s, where this technology was still relatively new. It'd been, the car technology had probably been around for about 50 years and only really had become widely used from the sort of 20s onwards. So Ford, I think, was kind of started. The Model T Ford was probably around the sort of 1910s or 20s, wasn't it? I'm not quite so sure with dates, but something along those lines.
Yeah, it was. It was like the very early days of this.
Yeah, and I think it's very much tied in with the sort of mythos of our contemporary culture and our world. In the same way that loads of sort of folk songs from Mongolia and Tuva and places like this are about horses, which is, was their primary mode of transport. For some of them still is. And there is something about that personal, having your own means of transport. You can go anywhere. I mean, I'm the first to admit the car makes a whole bunch of things a whole lot easier. It really does. If you've got to carry lots of stuff and get to a place that's miles away, just chucking it all in the boot and driving off. It's nothing like, no, there's nothing like it. And, if you have to carry it on your back, even if it's just to the train station, it is different. So there is that. I mean, Mad Max is a really funny one, I think, because it's the idea that the background of Mad Max is a kind of an oil crisis. And the result of the oil crisis is that everybody drives in cars all of the time.
I know.
It doesn't make any sense.
And it's like hyper dependency, isn't it? Or a hyper, if not, maybe not conscious celebration, but it's like, this was the mode of transport that was becoming extinct. But it's the only one we have. Because you don't see anyone in Mad Max on horseback.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this sort of, it's the sort of the dream. The dreaming of our culture, which imagines a kind of harsh barbarian culture and environment that uses our own technology. So it's just kind of it's the dreamlike nature of it. It's the kind of unrestrained lawlessness. You can give free rein to the id and sort of these kind of fantasy barbarian societies, which are harsh, but, kind of give some sort of outlet to these reckless, dangerous, violent impulses that we have, especially men. But women to some extent too.
Oh yeah, and there's something phallic about the car. We talk about, like, penis extension and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
I've heard that throughout my life. Of being around car culture, shall we say? So
Yes. Yeah, that you see someone with a sports car and you go, oh, he's compensating for something, that kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah, and no doubt some people are, but you're right. I mean, because women have different relationships to cars than the men do in general, and there's something to that.
Yeah.
No doubt. So maybe we'll cut to more concrete issues with in terms of transport and freedom of movement. One of the big trends at the moment, of course, is electrification of transport. Electric cars, but also driverless cars. But it seems to me that in itself is an agenda that is not what it seems to be on the surface, because electrification of transport, let's just take, day to day, the family car or whatever it happens to be, the electric cars cannot fulfill their stated role, which is to replace the fossil fueled fleet. Petrol and diesel cars go away, replaced by electric cars. That is not possible on a technical level. So it seems to me that what it's really about, not the environment, but mobility. So the electrification of the car fleet, truck fleet, whatever, and they're even talking about insane shit like, electric planes. It's never going to happen. So therefore, mobility will be reduced. And that is actually what this is about. And we already see in the early days, we haven't even got to some of these deadlines, about all cars must be electrified by a certain date. That's not even happened yet. And we're already seeing, things like, battery life, charging problems. There aren't enough charging stations, all of that. So that's indicating that this will not, the agenda as set out will not occur. So that's why I think it's about restricting mobility, and that was kind of baked into the cake from day one.
Yes, I think so. The idea of electrifying the whole transport system is, in its own way, it suddenly occurred to me, every bit as dreamlike as the Mad Max idea. It's just the sort of respectable, bourgeois, liberal Guardian reader's version of that dream, where you can still have your personal car and your affluent suburban lifestyle, but it's green because it's electric, so it doesn't smell of diesel exhaust, and it doesn't make any noise, and it's all kind of seems very safe on the surface until you just crunch some of the numbers down and you realize, hang on, how much power does it take to charge a battery, and how much of that power is going to be from fossil fuels anyway? Most likely quite a lot, especially judging by the way that renewables have been performing in Germany over the past year, which invested a huge amount in its renewable infrastructure. Well, guess what? They're opening loads of coal power plants now here. So obviously it didn't work out too well for them. That's just the sort of plugging it in and charging it bit, and how expensive that is. Then you get to the batteries themselves. What are they made of? What kind of processes are involved in getting these minerals, lithium, cobalt, coltan, all these other ones. I mean, they're probably updating the technology all the time. So nonetheless, battery lifespan is a massive problem. And once they're spent, then what do we do with them? Do we just let them lie around? Well, personally, I'd rather have a load of old diesel vehicles lying around that you can't use anymore. Well, in fact, you probably could do something with a diesel vehicle. You probably could, if it's just scrapped, then probably much easier to get it going again, or, break it up for parts, than an electric vehicle, which is just toxic materials, really dangerous. They explode when they catch fire. They can't put it out. Was it Luton Airport I can't remember. There was an airport
Oh,
somewhere.
the car park.
Yeah, the car park. Massive
Yeah.
fire. And they said, oh, it wasn't an EV that caught fire, but there were EVs there that it wasn't an EV that started it necessarily. That's what they say. Nonetheless, there were loads of EVs in the car park that caught fire. And a car on fire or a bus on fire or something is a dicey thing for sure. You don't want to be near one of those. But an electric vehicle on fire is a whole different ball game. I mean, anyone who wants to see something that will scare the pants off them, type in EV battery fire on YouTube, and you'll see some infernos there. So the whole thing, as you say, the fact is that I don't think these things are going to become much cheaper to make, to buy, to run in the next decade or so. So I think you're right. I think that whether it's by design a means to reduce people's mobility by making transport really expensive and making it difficult to get hold of the most efficient motorized vehicles that we have, which are petrol and diesel at this point, or it's just an accident and they're all just sort of boardroom minded PowerPoint presentation filled sort of statistical gobbledygook believers that actually think that we could electrify the whole fleet. I'm sure there are lots of people like that in these focus groups and advisory boards as well. Either way, either it just won't fly and they'll have to walk back on it, which I think they are to some extent on a lot of these net zero things, or it will just end up with very few cars on the road because it will be quite expensive to run an electric vehicle. And if you can't buy a new diesel car or a petrol car, then what are you going to do? You're going to have to walk, I suppose. But they'll probably try and limit that as well. They'll say you can't walk too far because you might be going to do something. You might be walking somewhere and expending carbon or something.
Well, that's already been done, during the C-19 period. You can't.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's already been done. Well, what you're describing there is in terms of an agenda. Is there one, and is it deliberate? It's a kind of conspiratorial versus the cock-up theory of history that they talk about, isn't it? Is this being done deliberately, or is it just incompetence?
Yeah.
I tend to think it's a combination of both.
Yeah, I go with that as well. I was making this case to a friend of mine recently who I hadn't seen for a while. And he was kind of going, it's all just cock up and, there's no conspiracies. It's just opportunism. And I was going, well, there's a lot of spectrum. There's a wide spectrum in between just opportunism and incompetence and, naivety and gullibility and conscious, deliberate conspiracy. It's very hard for me to, I mean, another friend actually brought up an interesting point, just as a side note, is, why do they show us the Davos meetings? Why do they film them? Where they never film like the Bilderberg meetings or the Trilateral Commission or any of those things. So why do they want us to see Davos? And, maybe it is a distraction to make us think that these people are just blundering, vacuous idiots, because you would get that impression if you watch Davos. And in fact, they are much more scheming and conspiratorially minded than you would get from watching these sorts of boring PowerPoint presentations about the sustainable initiatives of the markets of the future and all this sort of thing. Even though they do discuss things in Davos that obviously do sound quite sinister. So I don't know, basically, but I'm like you, I tend to think there's a lot of a combination of the two, I think, going on.
Well, one thing I did was subscribe to the World Economic Forum YouTube channel.
Oh, right, yeah.
To get all updates, everything. And oh my God, if you'd like to sink rapidly into a coma, then please subscribe to that channel, because I mean, there's updates almost every day of talks, and it's just unbelievable. The asinine, it's just ridiculous.
Really boring, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredibly so, almost in a calculated way.
Yes. Which would kind of support this idea that maybe it's just, this. But then again, anyone who's been involved in an organization or seen people who are power hungry operate, they often are like that. They're just bland, vacuous people, and the higher up you get, I guess you probably do get a greater evil in some way, but perhaps it just doesn't get any more interesting than that. I don't know.
I know. I think you're probably right. In terms of what we're talking about overall, freedom of movement, transport, what a lot of people don't get in terms of renewables, whether it's electric cars or solar panels or wind turbines or offshore energy, is that all of that, the infrastructure behind it, but also the literal, the wind turbines and the solar panels and the batteries for the electric cars are completely 100% dependent on fossil fuels for their production.
Yeah.
You cannot make renewables with renewables.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com